My guest today is Professor Ziv Williams, who is Associate Professor of Neurosurgery at Harvard University. The major goal of his lab has been to investigate neural computations that underlie motor and cognitive behavior. Welcome, Ziv.
Good to good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I got some of your papers, and I want to go through them, and then I want to have more of they're sort of in the similar areas, so I want to sort of connect them to a more macro conversation. So the first one is single neuronal predictions of others' beliefs in humans. I found this so fascinating, Zev. So you say here human social behavior crucially depends on our ability to reason about others. This capacity for theory of mind has a vital role in social cognition because it enables us not only to form a detailed understanding of the hidden thoughts and beliefs of other individuals, but also to understand that they may differ from our own. Although a number of areas in the human brain have been linked to social reasoning and its disruption across a variety of psychosocial disorders, the basic cellular mechanisms that underlie human theory of mind remain undefined. Yeah, so um, this is a question for a lot of different disciplines, philosophy, medicine, in some sense, even physics. Let me ask you, sort of start. I want to start at the basement. So what exactly is a neuron?
Right, that's a really good and nice place to start the conversation, the question. So neurons are out, to put it simply, are the most basic computational building block by which information is essentially encoded in the human brain. So these are individual cells, and your brains have billions of them. So different parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, or the front part of the brain, or the occipital cortex, each has many billions of neurons. They all communicate with each other, and they together form what we perceive as thoughts or ideas, experiences. Pretty much everything that we do are based on the little ones and zeros that these individual neurons
Hmm.
do, and they make these computations at very fast scales. So on the order of milliseconds, we're making all these really complex decisions and coming up with these very novel thoughts. And these are essentially the culmination of the activities of all these individual cells in the brain.
So I think we'll get there. So when you say neuron is a computational unit, um, do we know if they're computing? I mean, what I mean is that we are into this digital world where zeros and ones fly around. Um, do you know if neurons are actually in a sort of a digital computation world, or are they using some sort of analog mechanism?
Yeah, it's a good question. We don't absolutely know what individual neurons are doing. At a very basic level, we know enough about it. And so, unlike other parts of the body where you have these individual well-confined cells, neurons have many branches called axons and dendrites.
Yeah.
So these are ways for individual neurons to connect to other neurons in the brain. And the ones and zeros are essentially what we call the action potentials. And these are very brief bits of activity where the cell will, what we say, fire or spike,
Hmm.
where it has a sudden increase in the electrical activity that will go up and then go down. And it's this very complex combination of ones and zeros, so these action potentials, across many hundreds and thousands of millions of neurons that together encode some kind of information. Now,
Hmm.
we're only able to really sample from a few cells out of many billions of cells in your brain at a given time. So we kind of get an idea of what these cells may be doing. So for example, In some cases, there may be certain cells that may activate whenever you see a certain object like an apple or an orange, and some neurons may activate whenever you see something like a dog or a cat. And based on this really simple dichotomy, we can start asking basic questions about how these cells encode information about the world around us. We still don't know really what they're doing at a true sense, though.
Yeah, so but what's fascinating about your research is that they are also encoding what they believe others are thinking or others might be doing, right? This is something that we don't have in AI, as they call it now, by any stretch of the imagination, right? So how do they get there? I mean, I know that this should have had an evolutionary advantage. If you can read somebody else's mind, you'll probably survive a lot longer. And so whoever who survived, we are all here, have that capacity to read somebody else's mind, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, it's a really a fascinating phenomenon. So a lot of us do this. We do this every day. We're probably doing it right now. I'm trying to think what you're thinking about what I'm thinking. Do you really like me? How's this conversation going? So these are things that are happening all the time. And like you said, it is really a core component of social behavior. So our ability to read each other's thoughts, which are, essentially they're inherently unknown and unobservable. There's no way for me to physically peer into your brain and see what you're thinking. But it's very critical to our ability to interact effectively. So it's something that has evolved. Certain animals, to some degree, are thought to possess some basic degree of theory of mind. So certain great apes, for example, have been shown to have a rudimentary element of theory of mind. And essentially what it means is that, like you said earlier, it's my ability not only to infer what you may be thinking, but to also know that you may be thinking something that is incorrect or false and distinct from what I'm thinking. So it's this ability to separate my thoughts from your thoughts, and also to know that you may view the world very differently than how I view the world. Now, it's also interesting, you did raise a question about AI and whether AI has the ability to do this. And we've actually been testing this question to at a very basic level. And some of the newer AI models like Llama and GPT-4o have a surprising capacity at solving these really complicated theory of mind type questions. So I can give you a very simple example, something like you and Bob are sitting on a table, drinking coffee. As Bob goes to the restroom, you hide his coffee mug under the chair, just as you're doing right now.
Yeah.
And when Bob comes back, where does he think the cup may be? And my ability to know that Bob probably thinks that the cup is still on the table, even though I know that it's under the chair, is this really basic form of theory of mind. And we've shown that AIs are able to do this to a certain degree, but not perfectly.
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, Ziv. So that is sort of a mathematical problem in the sense that suppose I have lot of previous cases where the coffee cup is always on the table. Then I could make a probability, prediction where the coffee cup is going to be. But what your research is showing is that you could actually sort of dynamically figure out what the other person is thinking or her actions could be in the future, and whether this is most important thing, whether it's true or false, in some sense. So this is much more complex phenomenon, I think. I don't know if I'm understanding this correctly. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you said it very, very well, actually. There are very various degrees of this. So like you said, for example, if let's say we interacted many times, and every time we interacted, let's say we're playing a bartering game or a simple economic game. Every time we interacted, you cheated.
Yeah.
At some point, I would figure out and know that the next time you're
Yes.
going to sneeze. And so that's, it's a very basic level of social reasoning where I can uh, infer what you're likely going to do, but it's not entirely truly theory of mind. So my ability to observe what you're doing and based on those observations know what you're likely going to do next is an important component of it. But
Yeah.
the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and view the world the way they view it or think about it is a little bit of a higher level
Yeah.
aspect of that. And that is a much more complex computation or ability. So it's also interesting because it's something that is very unique to human ontogeny. So kids don't truly have a fully developed theory of
Yeah.
mind. It blows their mind to know that other people may view the world completely
Right.
different than they do, and you can kind of see it, right? And so people develop it a little bit later in life, and so it's one of those really high level human unique
Mm.
cognitive processes that we're very interested in.
Yeah. So I'm sort of arguing with myself. So what that implies is that experience, lot more data, actually helps you do some sort of machine learning technique as simple as regression and assign a probability what that person might be doing, might be thinking, could do, and so on. So you need a lot of data for that. You need a lot of examples. When the child shows up, she doesn't have a lot of examples, but she seems to do pretty well actually at the beginning, right? I mean, how do we explain this from a neuroscience or neurology perspective?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and we don't know honestly for sure. Part of it is likely an innate process. It's an innate ability that humans have. Language is also, to a certain degree, based on theory of mind, although it's thought to be processed by somewhat different but overlapping systems in the brain. And so my sense is, and people have looked at this behaviorally as well, is that if you never interacted with another person, so you grew up
Hmm.
on an island in the middle of nowhere, and you landed in the middle of New York City and asked to do a theory of mind task, you probably
Yes.
wouldn't be doing so
Yes.
well. But so it's likely a combination of, like you said, it's experience, but also some innate ability.
Hmm.
Uh, and to a certain degree, it's also, disrupted. We see it actually being disrupted in individuals with conditions like autism spectrum disorder.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of a debate as to, what components of it are truly disrupted in individuals with autism. But there are certain conditions where you can actually see it. You can see kids that have a hard time
Hmm.
forming inferences about somebody else's feelings.
Hmm.
And there's this interesting distinction between self-centered, self-centered view of the world and an allocentric view of the world, which is essentially how I view others viewing the world. So you do see this in certain conditions.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the general question is whether human kids and any primate kids show up with some sort of basic operating system with certain instructions that doesn't require a lot of experience. So I am fond of saying, a child is born knowing how to smile and survive, and smiling is a beautiful technique to survive, actually, And so we are given some basic instructions to basically survive. But your research is not something I ever thought about, which I mean, is a child thinking what the mom is thinking, or could potentially extrapolate what the actions could be without any instructions? And I'm thinking, 1, 2 year old kid.
Yeah,
That part is uncertain, right? Is it?
yeah. Yes and no. So it's interesting. So even in pre-verbal infants, you can track things like their attention or their facial responses, their iris, where they're looking at, where they're focusing on. And even at that level, they're able to make these really basic inferences, which are kind of essentially the early building blocks of theory of mind, where you see these two anthropomorphic objects. So like a square and a circle, you
Mm.
know, interacting with each other. So they're not people and they can't speak, but they have scenarios where they have um, scenarios in which you can kind of infer what the square thinks about the circle or how the circle feels in relation to the square. And it's really interesting. They actually are picking up on some of these innate cues even before they had any kind of formal training or
Mm.
but it's hard to tell for sure. And honestly, one of the reasons that we were very interested in these studies where we're able to record the activities of neurons in the human brain is to start asking what are the actual uh, computations, what are the actual processes that are ongoing
Mm.
in the brain as you're making these really complex inferences. And so it was really interesting. We found some really cool components that could explain some of it.
Yeah, so we could talk about this all day, Ziv. So in and so let's talk about this. So how do you so your lab sort of goes into a single neuronal level. I had never seen this before, and you could record this. You could record multiple neurons in close proximity. I would imagine. I'm speculating here, and you could sort of see what those neurons are doing in specialized experiments, right? So talk a little bit about that. What does your lab do in that context?
Right. These studies are essentially done in people in which we that are already undergoing neurosurgical procedures for certain medical conditions like tremor or Parkinson's disease. And for a very brief time period, we have an opportunity to just listen into the activities of the individual neurons as we're doing this procedure. Um, and so we use these very, very fine probes that are essentially the size of a human hair.
Hmm.
And we just record from the surface of the brain for a brief time period. And we're
These are
essentially,
mice models.
what's that again?
These are mice models, mouse models.
So no, these are in people. So people
Oh,
that are
human model. Okay.
undergoing, yeah, so undergoing neurosurgical procedures.
Okay.
And we use these very high resolution arrays that let us essentially listen to the chatter, the activity of these single
Hmm.
cells as the participants are doing these complex tasks, such as an inference about what somebody else is thinking. And so what we can do is we can track their activities and ask, for
Hmm.
example, if I'm thinking about what somebody else is thinking, are there certain neurons that are really finely tuned to somebody
Hmm.
else's beliefs? Are there
Some sort
neurons?
of specialization. Some sort of
Exactly,
specialization. Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
And it is interesting. We actually found that there are neurons that seem to be specialized
Hmm.
to focusing on what somebody else is thinking, and certain cells in
Hmm.
your own brain that are focused on thinking about what you're thinking. And you kind of, when you think about it, you kind of need this separation.
Hmm.
Uh, of dedicated circuits or neurons that focus on other people and those that focus on yourself and are able to disambiguate that information.
Hmm.
Um, but when you think about it, this is really complicated information, and it's kind of amazing that you can listen to these single individual neurons out of this really broad network of cells and
Yeah.
pick up these really unique bits of information. So it's likely not that these single cells are coming up with these ideas. They're likely integrating information from many parts of the brain to come up with these conceptual representations of self
Hmm.
and other, and what somebody else is thinking, what I'm thinking.
Let me ask you sort of a out on the left field question. Do you think neurons have a personality?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean it's interesting because your personality is essentially your brain.
Yeah.
And it's something that we've always been, I've been very fascinated with this question. So we all have brains, we're all humans, but we have these vastly different personalities. And so some people may be, more serious, some people may be less, some people a bit more intelligent than some less. And it kind of like all these components come together and build your personality. So I say from that perspective, every neuron does have its unique personality. But they also, it's an interesting mixture of things, because what we know, this is true from studies in animals, they've shown that it's not like every cell has just one thing that it does in its life. So it's not like there's a cell that will only respond to an image of Apple or the Mona Lisa.
Yes.
They may get really excited when they see these these individual things, but they do many other things too. To some degree, they'll activate whenever, for example, they see something round or something that is any food item, but maybe to a different degree. And it's really the combination of all these cells that pick on different bits and pieces of your environment that come together to create this conceptual representation of reality. And it's really interesting that there have been certain groups that have shown that also, if you see, for example, an apple in real life and then remember it or imagine it, very similar cells will activate. And you can actually even activate those cells to create a fake representation. So you can almost implant the memory into somebody in that way. So it's really interesting. We're just starting to get a sense of how these neurons do what they do, but it's not as simple as just a neuron doing one thing and nothing else.
Yeah. So do you think it's experience? Do you think it's hysteresis? So suppose I grew up in an apple farm, and my dad took me there every morning, and my job was to pluck apples. I would imagine at some point my brain is only specialized in seeing apples and plucking them, right? So is it experience?
Yeah, it's true. To some degree, if and people have actually tested this to some degree in animals. Actually, your environment definitely shapes your experience. And I'll give you a few examples. So even language is thought to shape experience to some degree. So, for example, they found that in certain languages where there's a rich repertoire of ways of describing, for example, the color blue or red, but not the color black or white, for example, they will actually be much better at actually identifying different hues of blue or different hues of red compared to languages that don't have many names or ways of describing those colors. So somehow your experience does affect, or even how you talk about your experience does affect your ability to actually perceive those experiences. And conversely, they've shown that, for example, in certain animals that have never, for example, seen another animal's face or a certain type of object, that will actually affect the types of cells that they have in their brains that are tuned to respond to faces. So your experiences definitely affect you. So you may have many apple sensitive cells in your brain if you,
Yes.
if that's all you've experienced growing up.
Sorry. So does your research show there is some sort of excess, some neurons sitting back saying, okay, so I'm going to the Apple farm every day, but at some point I'm going to go to Harvard, and I have to sort of step in. So the other neurons sort of stepping back in some sort of capacity that they don't want to get noised by, so to speak, by apple farms. Is that such a phenomenon?
It's a good question. I don't know. I don't know that we necessarily know that. The way I think of it a little bit is that it's a little bit like tuning a tuning fork or tuning a piano. These neurons become tuned to pick up in certain experiences. So, for example, certain colors, certain orientations in the environment, certain movements. But the way that they get tuned on those experiences or those stimuli is through experience. So if you've never seen light, if you've never seen a certain orientation, for example, those neurons simply will not be tuned to that. So it's a combination of innate function and experience that fine tunes the activity of these cells. And it's experience plays a big component of it.
Yeah.
Same thing with social behavior. If you haven't had social interactions, it can be fairly cognitively damaging. There are
Yeah.
studies of orphans that have grown up in really harsh conditions without much social experience.
Yeah, so I want to talk about ASDs. So I want to go to one paper. So single neuronal elements of speech production in humans. So you say here humans are capable of generating extraordinary diverse articulatory movement combinations to produce meaningful speech. This ability to orchestrate specific phonetic sequences and the syllabification and inflection over sub-second timescales allows us to produce thousands of word sounds in a core component of language. So language is a very mysterious thing. Um, I can't even understand how that evolved. As you say in the paper, it's such a complex thing. I mean, we are throwing noises at each other in this podcast, and somehow we can put it all together and make sense out of that. That is something that is inexplicable in many ways, right? So what does the paper say?
Yeah, it's honestly, it's a really remarkable process when you think about it. We all do it seamlessly. We do it very fluently too. So when we're talking, we produce up to 3 or 4 words per minute. I'm just essentially throwing at you these random sound signals. You're able to somehow glue it all together into individual words, extract their meaning, and then even beyond that, glue them all together into bigger phrases and sentences and come up, with representations of really complex concepts like, the brain. So one of the things that we were interested in trying to understand is how does this happen in the brain?
Hmm.
And so each movement that you produce has each articulatory movement or each movement that you make with your mouth produces a certain sound signal. So like ka in kite or ba in boy. So that's a bilabial consonant. And so what we found is that there are certain cells and parts of the brain that are thought to be involved in word planning and production that will very uniquely respond to these very unique sound elements. So whenever there's a word in my mind that I want to say that happens to have the sounds ka, ta to create the word cat,
Yeah.
those cells will activate, and very shortly afterwards, I will produce that word.
Yeah.
Now, language producing words is even more complex than that. You have to syllabify these phonemes. So you have to syllabify, group them into these prosodic structures. So like how you intonate these different articulatory elements. And we also found that the way that the brain encodes this really complex information follows that structure. I'd say probably the coolest thing that we found that was a little surprising is that we could actually, to a certain degree, predict what somebody was going to say before they said it. So
Yeah.
we could listen into the neurons in the brain. We can say, okay, they're probably going to say a ka sound followed by a sound followed by a ta sound. And based on that, they're likely going to say something like cat
Yeah. Yeah.
before they even said it, several up to a few hundred milliseconds before. So it's really interesting. You can actually read quite a lot out of people's brains if you have the right techniques.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. So, there's this whole phenomenon going on called Chat GPT,
Yep.
which my bias tells me it's a stochastic parrot. It just assigning a probability for the next word to come. So if you can mathematically show that a computer can assign a probability for the next word, then human brains, which are, I believe are immensely more powerful, could do that very easily. So it is not a stochastic phenomenon. Maybe if I understand you correctly, you're saying it's not a stochastic phenomenon. It is like the brain is already ahead of its own expectations. So how do you differentiate between these two? I mean, we have ChatGPT doing all sorts of interesting things. I mean, people are, uh, you know, they think this is artificial intelligence. So where do you come out on that?
Yeah, that's a big question. I'll start with that. So, I'd say from the way we look at the brain, it's yeah, the way that cells fire are very stochastic, but there is a deterministic component to that. So how we structure certain components of speech production, where we can actually predictably tell what's going to happen based on the activity of neurons.
Yeah.
On the other end of things, we're also, for example, constantly decoding what somebody else is saying. So
Yeah.
I can likely predict, for example, if you said something like the dog chased thee, I'd
Yeah.
say with a high probability you're probably going to say cat
Yes.
or something like that.
Yeah.
But
Right.
it's all patterns, right? These are all statistical patterns. And so you can say, well, you're just throwing some statistics at it and there's nothing more to it. But when you think about it, and it's true to a certain degree, but when you think about language has many elements. So it has a syntactic structure, it has semantic meaning.
Yeah.
Much of these meanings are predicated on your experience of cats and dogs and what they do.
It's constrained. It's a constrained optimization problem in some
Yeah,
sense, right?
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly, yeah. And you can actually even quantify it. So there's
Yeah.
this way of quantifying how predictable something is, like surprisal or entropy. And you can calculate. I can actually give you an exact number to how likely a certain word is going to follow another. And what we found that this was in a different study to try to understand how the brain decodes meaning. So how do I understand things, or how do I understand the meaning of words during language comprehension? We found that you can actually decode at a very coarse level the the meaning categories of individual words. So I can actually tell
Hmm.
you from the activities of brain cells whether I just heard a word that describes a food item or an animal or an object.
Hmm.
But I could also predict those words much better if they were predictable. So if the person that listening to the sentence knew what was likely going to come up,
Hmm.
um, the neurons were much better at actually predicting what that word was going to be. So
Hmm.
I could read information from your brain and also decode to a certain degree of accuracy what you're actually listening to and what you're likely predicting or thinking the next word is going to be. So there's
Yeah.
a lot of overlap, but with models like ChatGPT, uh, but and there's some parallels, but it's clearly the AIs are not doing exactly what the brain is doing. It's kind of mimicking it to a certain degree.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to ask you something. It's not in your research. So is there groupthink going on? So what I mean is, if the neurons are sort of talking to each other and say, I am in this club and that club, some information comes in, and the club decides
Yeah.
what that information is all about. Is that going on?
Yeah, to a certain degree, there's some really beautiful early studies by predominantly in primates, actually, by people like Bill Newsom and others, Shadlin, and a few within the visual community who've shown that to a certain degree there's this kind of like winner take all process
Ah.
where the neural activity kind of collapses onto a common
Hmm.
decisional hyperplane, or if you can describe it that way.
Yeah.
So at some point, you can think of the way that the brain works as this really high dimensional representation of reality.
Hmm.
So if you
Okay.
took every neuron in the brain and you can assign a vector, it's kind of like called a one-hot vector, where it's either up or down, to keep it
Yeah.
simple. And you take all these billions of vectors, you create essentially a high dimensional 1 billion dimensional vector kind of a thing.
Hmm.
But at some point, to a certain degree, and again, I'm really simplifying this,
Yeah.
those end up collapsing onto a common manifold, or to a common, low dimensional plane that allows you to simplify these really complex either thoughts or decisions or sensory percepts into something that is simpler to represent and work with. Now, again, we don't truly know if that's what's happening because we can't record from billions of cells at a given time, but we can kind of sample from a few and make some inferences about what the brain is likely doing.
Yeah, this is so interesting, sir. So is it a democratic process? What I mean is that we have machine learning techniques called voting and things like that. So let's say we get some predictions from different techniques and we weight them and we get to a decision. Or is it some dominant neuron somewhere, an autocrat, who is saying, "Hey, you guys spend too much time on this. I'm going to." It's good.
We can talk about this forever. I mean, there's really beautiful research on the topic. So there are like these things called drift diffusion models that look at essentially accumulation of information. So people like Carlos Brody at Princeton and many others have looked into this. And so, essentially what they've shown is that at some point you kind of reach this threshold where you accumulate enough information to be confident enough of a decision. But it's really complicated, and that there's also literature on how dopamine works and confidence and probability is encoded in the brain. Most decisions are not that simple. So when you think about it, there's a lot of uncertainty in what we do. And even in how we perceive the world. So sometimes things may not be 100% clear. And we've studied this ourselves in cases where you can actually fuse faces together. So you can actually very gradually change from a happy face to a sad face or a sad face to an angry face. And where that transition occurs, it's a complex process, So it's a good question, though. I'd say the simple answer is we don't know for sure.
Yeah, I mean, this is so fascinating. I mean, what I was driving at is, yes, you said there's so much information and you have to make a decision. And let's say you're given 5 seconds to make a decision. Is it a democratic process? I mean, you're assigning probabilities, all this 10 billion neurons or whatever we're carrying in our head, saying, okay, this is the net outcome. Or is it somebody taking control of the process and saying, hey, this is where we're going? That you could measure, right, at the single neuron level, potentially?
Yeah, I see where you're taking on. So again, I wish I had a simple answer, but to a certain degree, yes. So we do see certain neurons that are much more aligned with your decision. So let's say I recorded from 1,000 neurons, a small proportion of them will be really highly informative of the decision, meaning that either they're causally driving those decisions or just simply highly correlated with them. There's also very nice studies in mice where you can optogenetically activate a single neuron. So what optogenetics essentially means is that you're able to shine a light on a single neuron in the brain. And to a certain degree, some of these groups have shown that even by modulating a single cell out of many millions of cells, you can shift the animal's decisions in one direction.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because this information kind of percolates throughout the whole network. Even though it's one cell, it's driving many other cells, and it has this kind of like waterfall downstream effect. So to answer your question, I would say to a degree, yes. The degree to which it's democratic, I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So I don't know if your experiments will show some sort of longitudinal effects. Suppose I have some sort of a thing in there in the brain, and I look at, I don't know how many neurons, you look at 1,000 neurons, and I put this mouse through experiences. Can we see some neurons sort of at some point over time start to dominate? What I'm driving at is there some sort of societal organizational thing that happens in this vast structure that we carry, we carry in our head. What do we know about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I, I would say I don't know the exact answer to that. Things definitely do change over time. That has a little bit more to do with experience and learning. The kind of the changes that I was talking about before, it happened, at millisecond resolution. So these
Yeah.
kind of decision processes where you are accumulating information in real time. But when you're learning, so let's say, at a very simple level, so this would be, for example, an animal experiment. Every time you stepped on, or every time you pressed one button, you got reward, and anytime you pressed another button, you didn't. Over time, the neurons in your brain kind of learn that association.
Yeah.
And slowly, you will see those changes over sometimes hours, sometimes days. And you can actually track that. You can track that. And you
Yeah.
can actually correlate that really well with learning rates. So you can see as the animal is learning and getting better, these cells get more and more tuned to
Mm.
those associations. So you do see
Is,
that.
is it hardwired? What I mean is that suppose we transplant the brain of the mouse that has been trained that way to another, would that mouse behave exactly the same?
So see if you had two mice that were given the exact same experience.
No, no. So the one mouse is trained, press zero and you get a reward, press one, you get electric shock. Been trained like that for a while, and the brain is tuned to that. Suppose we take the brain and put it on a completely different model. I don't know if it's possible. I'm making this up. So
Hmm.
um, so what I'm driving at is it a hardwired phenomenon? In other words, can we transfer information, knowledge,
Oh,
experiences in the brain to something else, somebody else?
yeah, to a certain degree. It depends on how similar the conditions are. So, some animals and people especially are very good at generalizing information. So, for example, in one environment, they do really well doing a certain thing, and they go into a slightly different environment. They can still generalize that information.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that kind of phenomena has even been shown in insects like bumblebees, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Generalize pretty complicated situations.
Yeah.
Whether it's hardwired and how that transition occurs is interesting, and there some really beautiful work by people like Edward Moser, who got the Nobel Prize, to try to understand how things that you learn in one environment translate into other environments,
Mm.
and what happens in the brain. And it's an interesting kind of morphing system that
Mm.
adapts to. There are certain things that are a little bit hardwired. There's certain things that do kind of shift, and you kind of when you think about it, you have to have that dynamic, but
Yeah.
also like some hardwired representation of the environment. So the things called like grid cells and place cells that are a little bit hardwired in the brain, where you kind of have this grid-like representation of everything around you, and that's kind of anchored a little bit, but then it
Yeah.
shifts based on where your environment is or what things are happening. So we're just starting to understand how this is all happening. I'm trying not to pretend like we know exactly.
No, no.
There's
This,
still a
this,
lot that we don't know. We're trying to figure out.
yeah, it's beautiful research. So I want to finish up with your last paper, semantic encoding during language comprehension at single cell resolution. We talked a little bit about this, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into this. So you say here from sequences of speech, sounds and letters, humans can extract rich and nuanced meaning through language. This capacity is essential for human communication. Yet, despite a growing understanding of the brain areas that support linguistic and semantic processing, the derivation of linguistic meaning in neural tissue at the cellular level and over the timescale action potentials remains largely unknown. So I'm thinking African savanna. Um, somebody came down down the tree, started making noises, and well, that person was thinking, and she was using noises to sort of communicate. But then, if she couldn't communicate, that would be bad. So there has to be some sort of societal development that has to be in place, right? This is a network phenomenon. So I'm thinking language and meaning. So do we know? I know this is not in your research, but do we know where sort of the network phenomenon started? That if I say something, somebody else sort of understands the meaning of what I'm saying. Do we? I mean, this is historically not possible. I mean, we're talking about 50, 100 million years, but do we have any idea how that started?
Yeah, no, that's a kind of, it's a very it's a very involved question. So part of that has to do with where did humans develop language? What is the ontology of human language, kind of like developing from from apes? And the second is, how do we map these random sound sequences into onto meaning? So for whatever reason, when I say apple, those random sounds map onto some picture in your head that it has a taste, a smell, a look. You may even have it has a very complex relationship to like apple pies and your mom cooking them in the background, on the weekend. So
Yeah.
all these things are floating in your head, and this is happening really rapidly as you're listening. So to kind of to start the story with human evolution, the answer is we don't know. There is interest. It's interesting. There have been a few genes that have been shown to be uniquely associated with language. That may, certain animals that do not have it, do not have. And to a certain degree, language is not truly solely unique to humans. We do it
Yeah. Yeah.
much better than many other animals. But canaries, zebra finches, many different kind of animals communicate. They even have certain syllabic components to the way they communicate. And so it likely emerged from some very primitive substrates that
Hmm.
allowed us to not only make these complex articulatory sounds, um, but also perceive them on the other end and decode them and decode the meaning.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like the short version of that. The question that we also wanted to ask is what are these actual meaning representations? Because
Yeah.
we all speak, we all know tens of thousands of words. Probably need a much smaller component of that to truly communicate, but um, we also combine them into different in different combinations and orders to create phrases and sentences. But the interesting thing that we found is that you have a fairly robust representation of meaning in the brain. And what I mean by that is that there are certain cells that respond fairly reliably to
Hmm.
any words that may refer to an animal or an object or to a
Hmm.
family member or to a food product, for example. But the really interesting thing is they're also highly contextual. So, for example, if I said, my son played ball, or the
Hmm.
sun set in the background, the word sun has the exact same phonetic form. So it sounds exactly the same. But when
Yeah.
I said those two things, you know exactly what I was talking about. I didn't
Yeah.
have to say, oh, this is a star in the sky, this is a human being. And so it's highly contextual. And what that proves to us to a certain degree is that these neurons really care about the meaning of the words as opposed to simply their word form, so how they sound like.
Hmm.
So it starts giving us an inkling of how we map these really complex meaning representations onto the activity patterns of neurons in the brain.
Yeah. So it's not just a sound; it's a context, and context is very abstract, very difficult to define. And so do you think it's specific to humans, or do you think that happens in other primates?
Yeah. Definitely they're animals. So for example, one of my good friends uh, 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 has shown in marmosets that they actually have, and actually two groups almost in parallel have shown that marmosets have a unique representation of identity, for example. So the
Hmm.
calls that different marmosets have will align with very specific identities. So it's almost like the animals have names. So it's
Yeah.
like, one, which is it's a very basic form of meaning.
Hmm.
And in certain animals like birds, context does play a role. So certain sounds are very contextualized, but nothing like humans. So we
Hmm.
don't truly know why. But when you take the combinatorial complexity of even like 100 words and putting them in different
Yeah.
ways, you can convey near infinite meanings, let alone the tens of thousands of words that we use as humans. There's almost an infinite amount of information that you can convey
Yeah.
through podcasts or other media.
Yes.
But it's really interesting. It's such a fascinating and unique process.
Yeah. So in the modern societal context, we have 200 countries. I don't know how many languages we have, maybe 1,000 different languages. We seem to be getting along. And I don't know how many accents we have. This is not your research, Siva. I want to ask you. So I grew up in South India, and I came to the US when I was 21 years old. And um, I picked up English much later. And, I was looking at accents. Accents are an interesting thing, actually, right? Because, if you had a world of 8.2 billion people who speak the same language with the same accent, it would have been much more efficient. Unfortunately, we don't have that. We have something completely different. And so how do we deal with these different languages and accents? It seems very complex,
Yeah,
from my own perspective. So where are we from a modern societal perspective?
yeah. It's really interesting. The development of accent it becomes a little hardwired in your brain after
Yeah.
puberty. So it's a kind of like mid-teenager to late teenage years.
Yeah.
And it's thought to essentially be embedded in parts of the brain. So areas like part of the prefrontal cortex called Broca's area, and other areas in the brain where those core elements or units, so these basic phonetic ways where you basically um, say particular speech sounds get hard baked to a certain degree in your brain. You're still able to learn different languages, you're still able to communicate, but that the way that you pronounce those sounds is really hard to unlearn,
Yeah.
which I think is really cool because variety of the spice is the spice of life to a certain degree.
Yeah.
Um, but it's also interesting how you can learn languages, and we're actually very curious about this. And there's my friend Eddie Chang at UCSF has done some really interesting work in bilingual speakers that has shown that there is an interesting overlap between, even though you may speak different languages, you presumably represent the word dog or cat or apple in a similar way, no matter what the input is. The same
Mm.
thing with modalities. You can see the picture of a dog and understand what that means. You can hear the dog. You can even hear a bark, and that bark will translate to the meaning, to a certain conceptual meaning of the dog. So meaning in the brain it's an
Yeah. Yeah.
interesting concept. It's this multimodal
Yeah.
thing. Um, the other very last thing, kind of following up on your question, is that there are also certain languages that are very tonal.
Yeah.
So, for example, Mandarin, Thai, is a very tonal language. And in English, there's zero tonality. We're just absolute plain vanilla, where there's no and you can have very similar sounding words with different tones having absolutely different meanings. I think for Westerners, it's very hard to learn that.
Yeah. So, but English is very efficient. So the well, let me make a statement. You might object to it. So if language is for communications, um, then one of the objective function has to be to make it. I don't want to create too many noises before I communicate X to Y, right? A lot of the Asian languages, for instance, I don't know much about this. I mean, I just know about, this small South Indian language I grew up in. Um, it's quite complex in many ways. So, and complexity comes with a cost in communication. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, and I was very curious about that as well. So there's certain languages like Spanish that are or Italian that are very fast. So
Yeah.
there are many more sounds per minute. But the kind of there are groups that have actually looked into this,
Hmm.
and you can actually quantify the amount of information that you can convey as bits per second. So a
Hmm.
byte is the least amount of information that you can convey. And
Yeah.
the interesting thing is that they found that even with fast, um, like kind of like these quote unquote fast languages, the amount of bits per second across languages is very, very similar.
Oh,
So you're
wow. Okay.
conveying the same amount of information or a very similar amount of information. And the thought is that your brain is able to process a certain kind of quote unquote like quanta of
Hmm.
information at a given time. So your brain is just not, so if like, let's say you sped up this podcast at two
Yeah.
times speed or three times speed, it will become progressively harder and harder for you to pick up all the information that is being conveyed. So
Whatever language it is, it's the same phenomenon.
irrespective of
Yeah.
language, for the most part, I'm simplifying a little bit,
Yeah.
but for the most part. So I think it has something to do a little bit with the information throughput, like how much information can you
Hmm.
not necessarily actually convey it, like how much can you pick up on?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So there's some sort of an upper bound constraint from information processing. So all the thousand languages or whatever we have today, I don't know, they would all have hit that constraint and would have titrated down, so to speak, to the to the optimum level. And so that has sort of a comparative language question. So I know German, for instance, was very efficient in engineering. We had a lot of advancement in the German language in engineering before English came along. So are there languages that are potentially very efficient in music, literature, and so on and so forth, but not, engineering and medicine? I mean, it's such an interesting thing to
Yeah,
study. I wondered. Yeah.
that is interesting. I don't know. I don't know. Um, but what I do know is that there are some languages that are much more precise in their meanings. So I think
Yeah.
we alluded to that a little bit before. So, for example, certain languages will literally just have one or two, maybe three words for the color blue, like no
Yeah.
shade, no none between. It's like
Yes.
blue and that's it.
Yes.
Some are very, very fine, finely defined based on different shades, and and so some languages are definitely more precise.
Yeah.
As some languages may, definitely have better and more elegant ways of talking about love or poetry. And,
Yes. Yes.
so yeah, there is some background, but it's a good question. I actually don't know. It's a fascinating question. Yeah.
Excellent, Sale. Yeah. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Yeah, absolutely. It was really fun. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.